is that we've lost the art. Yes, I'm going to say it. We've lost the art of compromise. We've lost the art of actually getting legislation passed in a productive way where two sides come together. You trade, you figure out where your side is right, where the other side's accurate, and you try to build something. The one big beautiful bill, the one big ugly bill, big beautiful bill act. I think that's all the names for this giant bill that has consumed the news lately. The question for today's episode is, why do we have giant omnibus bills? And no, the answer is not because President Trump is president. We've had these giant package bills for the last decade or so. And this bill was 1,000 pages long. I don't even know if most people listening to the show, I don't even know. Actually, I do remember the last time I read 1,000 pages. But most people these days don't have the capacity to read 1,000 pages, especially if you're a busy member of Congress, and yet you're required to vote on the one big, beautiful bill. So naturally, we got to understand, why do such bills exist at the time that we live in? Because I feel like we got to be able to make legislation a more effective, useful, impactful way. And that's the goal and the question of the show today. I appreciate everyone joining. Welcome to the Hopeful Majority. Every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your content, we come at you live. And importantly, we have monologues, we have interviews. I've got some great interview conversations actually lined up that I think folks are really going to appreciate. But today we have to ask the question, why does this big bill exist? Why do we have this type of legislation? Now, a quick detour down memory lane. This is not the first time you've had giant omnibus bills. And if someone is curious as to what an omnibus bill is, it's essentially one bill with a bunch of small bills. So, for example, the one big beautiful bill has legislation around immigration. It's got legislation on the border. It's got legislation related to Social Security, Medicaid, tax cuts, honestly, everything under the sun. Just one more example of our government operating at its finest, right? People oftentimes ask, why are young people not passionate about politics? People oftentimes ask, why are folks not interested in going to the government? Maybe it's because you're forced to read 1,000-page bills that then you suddenly have to vote on in 2 or 3 days. And if you don't, you get primaried. Maybe that's not the best way to produce legislation. These types of acts have actually existed in the past. Under President Obama, you had something called the Farm Bill that was passed. Under Bush, you had the Bush tax cuts, which had a lot of different legislations below it. The fact is that over the last 10 to 15 years, our government has shifted significantly in the way in which it passes legislation. Now, importantly, there's a lot of small bills that get passed on a daily basis that are small, independent bills. Some are Democratic bills, some are Republican bills. Those goes through. But there's this one giant fight that almost occurs every 1 to 2 years. You know, President Biden had the Chips and Sciences Act, but before that, he had the Build Back Better legislation that had a bunch of different small things in it. And the reason for it, I think, is simple. There's a lot of historical context. There's a lot of, I think, legalese that folks that are way smarter than this show can go to. But again, the goal of the Hopeful Majority is, how do we have open-minded conversations? How do we build a world in which there's less polarization? So oftentimes the objective of the show is to understand why the system of polarization drives the way that legislation and policies happen. And my view is that the reason why we have such big, giant bills that no one person can agree to, because there's so many different components in it, is that we've lost the art. Yes, I'm going to say it. We've lost the art of compromise. We've lost the art of actually getting legislation passed in a productive way where two sides come together. You trade, you figure out where your side is right, where the other side's accurate, and you try to build something. Now, let me pause for a second. I just said a word, the C word, compromise. And most people listening to this would immediately critique that word. The idea of compromise, no, Manu. We live in a world in which my side wins and your side dies, because that's the only way we move legislation forward. But I want to offer something different. I want to offer a different idea. Imagine I told you there's a democracy out there with 330 million people, all of whom look differently than each other, with different backgrounds, different ideas, different identities. And they're heavily armed, by the way. And they have to try to make it work. They have to build a polity, a society, a democracy, where people of different views get together and they come around a table and they try to build a legislative instrument. And I told you that they all have to agree to one vision of the world. You would say that's impossible. Not only is that impossible, but that's fantastical. That's too idealistic. It probably only happens through extreme oppression or repression. And the fact is, I think that's true. You can't have a complex democracy without compromise. Compromise exists in our relationships. It exists in our workplace, it exists in our daily lives. But this idea that you can't have compromise at the national level is not only anathema to the way that democracy operates, but I think it spells the end of the way that our system currently works. Pluralism, this idea that you have people of different views come together to solve a complex issue, like, let's say, immigration, and they posit their idea. The other side posits their idea. You recognize that maybe on most issues, one worldview isn't right all the time, but that it's historically dependent. Maybe we have to figure out ways to push things together in a productive way. No, that sounds crazy. You can't have that. Now, importantly, compromise does not mean that you're giving up on your values. Not at all. If I sat down with my friend and we had a disagreement and we compromised on the restaurant to eat at, that doesn't mean suddenly I abandon all the food that I've loved for my entire life. No, what it means is for that instance, I believe that there's a way in which we can achieve net positive gain. Now, you're sitting here saying, yes, that's true, but in the world of politics, people's livelihoods are on the line. How can you compromise with people's conception of who they are, what their lived experiences are? And the fact is that that argument has gotten us to the point that we are in today. If you view the world as every fight is completely existential and I can only win 100% of the time, which means that the legislation that makes it to the House, to the Senate, has to be exactly the way that I see it fit. Otherwise, there's no chance for the other side to vote on it. That gets us to this point today, where no progress has been made on many issues. In fact, the resistance has only gotten stronger on many of the issues that folks might care about. Compromise is about moving the ball forward one step at a time, recognizing that progress is not linear, as Dr. King talked about. How does this relate to the One Big Beautiful Bill? Well, the reason why it relates to One Big Beautiful Bill is I was actually listening to Thomas Massie, Representative Thomas Massie, who's one of the few Republican holdouts in the bill. He's a libertarian member of Congress, lives out in Kentucky. He actually has a fascinating lifestyle. He lives apparently off the grid, completely on his own. He's got a F-150 with a giant camper and solar panels. He apparently went to MIT. Really smart scientist engineer. Maybe one day we have to ask on this show what causes someone that went to MIT to go work in Congress. But Thomas Massie was on Theo Vaughn's podcast, and he was talking about how if you're a member of Congress, and let's say in this bill, you represent Kentucky, there'll be a legislative element in this bill that is meant to appease you, right? So let's say for Kentucky, it's farm subsidies. But then there's 100 other also amendments in this bill that you absolutely despise. But you as a member of Congress are probably going to be forced to vote for it, even if there's a bunch of other things that you don't like, because the farm subsidies benefit your constituents. And if you don't vote for it, you're going to get primaried when you go back to Congress, go back to your district, go back to your constituents. See how perverse that incentive structure is? In fact, it's so perverse that Lisa Murkowski, let's roll the clip here. Lisa Murkowski, watch this. This is her response to being asked, what do you think about the bill and your vote on the bill?
Senator Paul said that that your vote was a bailout for Alaska at the expense of the rest of the country.
Oh my God.
That's what Senator Paul said.
My question was easy.
I have an obligation to the people of the state of Alaska. And I live up to that every single day. I fight for my state's interests, and I make sure that Alaskans are understood. I work hard to take care of a state that has more unique situations, more unique people, and it's just different. And so when people suggest that federal dollars go to one of our 50 states in a, quote, bailout, I find that offensive. I advocated for my state's interests. I will continue to do that, and I will make no excuses for doing that. Do I like this bill? No.
She's completely silent. And then she's like, it's not a bailout for Alaska. I have to vote for it because it supports my Alaskan constituents, but I also don't actually like the bill. So we're constructing legislation that most members of Congress, it's this giant Frankenstein bill, right, where you throw in stuff so that most members of Congress can appreciate it and like something of it, but then they hate everything else, but they have to vote for it. And so you get this one giant package, which is the worst form of compromise in all ways. It's not even compromise. It gets to the core problem of why it's such a the legislative process exists. It's because we have built a system that rewards not problem solving, but disruption. We built a system that rewards breaking, but not building. We built a system in which legislators are not oftentimes supported. Frankly, they don't get any points for working with someone on one specific issue, let's say immigration, to really try to figure out how we can create a long term solution so that it's not every 4 years it gets swinged back and forth. And we've lost that art. And the reason why we've lost that art is because the system just does not incentivize. People get smashed for actually working with each other. And so then what happens is if you're trying to pass a legislative priority on, let's say, border and immigration and Social Security and Medicaid, the fact is that it will take too long for there to be one bill for each of those issues. Congress will be there for 180 years and that issue will be gone. And instead, what happens is they'll say, okay, we're going to have one legislative session. We're going to smash this all together. Nobody has any chances. The president's going to rally his party and his members of Congress to get behind him. Otherwise, they'll risk primaries. The other side just has to suck it. And then we pass massive legislation. We have to resolve the incentive structures that drive governance. And that is the goal of the show. The idea behind the hopeful majority. What's the reason why we created this? The idea behind the hopeful majority is that the problem is not necessarily that we're divided. We've always been divided. We've always had to compromise. We've always had to work together. The problem is that you have a loud minority of voices that exist across the political spectrum. The crazies, as some might call them, but more importantly, they're really passionate folks that have really strong views, but they exist in a zero-sum mindset. It's my way or the highway. Those folks have driven us in an environment where they control the microphone. And so the rest of us stay silent. And so what happens is you only hear these really loud voices. And when you only hear the loud voices, whether it's on social media, whether it's in podcasts, whether it's on mainstream news, they've built an environment in which compromise, in which conversation, in which the tenets of the hopeful majority, open-minded, curious, problem-solving thinking, the things that are needed in a democracy, are not only despised, but discouraged. In fact, you're a sucker if you're someone that falls for the notion that you have to listen to the other side. And as a result, you've got a system that then grinds to a halt because members of Congress can't compromise. You've got media outlets whose only job is to tear down the other side for viewership and ratings. You've got a president that has to, no matter who it is, whether it's President Trump, President Obama, President Biden, President Bush, they have to score legislative wins while they're in office to fulfill their promises, or at least claim that they fulfilled their promises. And so you basically have a giant bad faith effort to importantly resolve some of the most pressing problems of our time. And this is the biggest tragedy of the moment. The people that lose, because you have things like the big beautiful bill or the farm bill from the Obama era or the Bush tax cuts, these giant legislative behemoths that are meant to make it through Congress, the people that lose are the American people. The problems don't actually get resolved. And that is a tragedy. That's a problem. And I think the goal of the show and the goal of us building this thing together, the goal of trying to bridge our differences and have these conversations is to throw a wrench in the loudest voices and the way in which the system operates. In fact, bridge building is the counterculture of today. The big, beautiful bill, 1,000 pages, would not exist in a world in which we could actually sit down and resolve our issues and differences on policy issues one by one. Now you might say, Manu, that's impossible. There's big money interests. Manu, that's impossible. Open primaries. Manu, that's impossible. There are real value differences, and I would never sit down with the other side. Great. I get that. But there is a basic incentive structure of a society that needs to be reoriented, and it needs to be resolved. And I think the people, the hopeful majority of people, are essential to driving that. Because they are the ones, we are the ones, the majority of folks that actually believe in open-minded conversations, that want to solve our problems, that want to not have giant behemoth pieces of legislation, but want our legislators to sit down and be able to resolve issue by issue. American democracy is a fascinating experiment. It's a really important experiment. We've had episodes in the past. You could go to episode 2, actually, where we talk about the fact that America is the most ambitious experiment in the history of democracies. It's this idea, again, as I said earlier in the show, 330 million people, all of whom look differently than each other, are going to get together to try and make it work while they're heavily armed. That's a really fascinating proposition. It's historically ambitious. And as a young person, we want it to work. The obstacle is that if we don't reward problem solving in our society, we have efforts like the one big beautiful bill, one ugly bill, whatever you want to call it. And democracy requires us to be able to resolve these issues at this time. And that is why I think the big beautiful bill exists, is because we've lost the art of problem solving and compromise. And as a result, we have to resort to such nonsense procedures to try and get things done. And that's a tragedy. Question, and here's the hope point of optimism, is that we, the people, actually have the opportunity to resolve that. Because tomorrow, I guarantee it, if you started to build a society in which we rewarded lawmakers for actually solving problems, not getting the most clicks on Twitter, not getting the most clicks on TikTok, if we actually showed up to vote rather than only the extreme showing up in their primaries, incentives would shift like that. So question is whether or not we want that. Because I think the country needs not one big beautiful bill, not one big ugly bill, but many small beautiful bills that can all solve problems. And that's my attempt at trying to drive at the fact that we've got a unique opportunity this moment. I'm so grateful to everybody for listening. I appreciate you. If you're on YouTube, leave a like, comment. Again, we're building the hopeful majority one step at a time. If you're on Spotify, Apple, if you're listening to this in audio, leave a review, because importantly, it takes all of us. And next week, we're going to have a fascinating interview conversation with someone that has already been on the show, but just released a book that I think we all need to hear and we all need to listen to. So I'll see you next week. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your time. And most importantly, let's start elevating the hopeful majority, because I think everyone's had enough of giant, beautiful bills. Take care, everyone.